The clock struck midnight, and the small town of Eldridge lay under a heavy blanket of fog. At the very edge of this quiet town, nestled between towering oak trees, stood an old house. Its windows were dark, and the wooden porch creaked under the weight of the evening wind. Inside, Daniel, a man in his early 40s, sat in a dimly lit room surrounded by dusty books and fading memories. He lived alone, a writer struggling with a story he couldn't finish. For years, he had sought solitude, but tonight that calm was about to shatter. Just as he sipped his lukewarm coffee, a sharp scratching sound echoed through the silence. It was faint at first, then growing more desperate. Claws against wood, followed by a low, agonizing whine. Daniel froze, listening. He had never heard anything like it. With hesitant steps, he moved toward the front door, his heart pounding. Daniel opened the door slightly, peeking through the crack. His eyes widened as he saw a large dog, its fur matted and soaked in blood, staring up at him with pleading eyes. One of its legs hung limply, and a deep gash ran along its side. The dog whimpered. But what made Daniel gasp wasn't just the sight of the injured animal. It was the silver collar around its neck, engraved with strange symbols he couldn't recognize. Despite his fear, Daniel couldn't turn the creature away. He carefully opened the door wider, allowing the dog to limp inside. The dog looked around as if it had been there before, finding a corner to rest, its breaths shallow and quick. Daniel gathered towels and a first aid kit, his hands shaking as he tended to the dog's wounds. As he worked, he noticed that every time he touched the dog's fur, a faint glow emitted from the collar. As the night grew deeper, Daniel sat beside the sleeping dog, unable to shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He examined the collar closely and realized that the symbols seemed to shift under his gaze, as if alive. He took out an old book of ancient languages, comparing the collar's etchings to those in his book. His breath caught as he recognized some of the symbols. They were from a lost civilization, believed to have vanished centuries ago. That night, as Daniel finally drifted into a restless sleep, he was haunted by vivid dreams. In them, he saw a grand city made of silver and stone, with dogs standing guard at every gate. He watched as a war broke out, fires consuming the city, and heard a voice whispering his name from the flames. When he woke, the dog was standing by the window, staring out into the night as if waiting for something or someone. The next evening, as Daniel tried to make sense of what was happening, a soft knock echoed at the door. He hesitated before opening it to find a woman standing in the moonlight, her eyes as pale as ice. She introduced herself as Elara and asked to see the dog. Before Daniel could answer, the dog stepped forward, baring its teeth and growling lowly. Elara's gaze hardened. "You shouldn't have let him in," she whispered. "Now, they'll come for you too." Inside, Elara explained that the dog was no ordinary creature. It was a guardian, a being from an ancient world, sent to protect a powerful secret buried beneath the town. But someone, or something, had wounded it and now hunted it relentlessly. Daniel struggled to process her words, but deep down, he knew the truth had already taken root. His quiet life was over, replaced by a mystery that went far beyond anything he had ever imagined. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the moment. Shadows moved outside, and strange figures began circling the house. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their shapes were unlike anything Daniel had seen, part human, part beast. Elara stood quickly. "They've found us." Daniel realized that his choice to help the dog had set something powerful and dangerous in motion. Now, it was a fight for survival and for answers. Daniel's mind raced as he locked the door. Elara moved swiftly, drawing symbols in the air that glowed for a moment before fading. The dog stood at the center, eyes glowing faintly, as if preparing for a battle it had fought before. Outside, the shadowy figures pressed against the windows, their claws scraping the glass. A deep growl reverberated from the dog, echoing through the house like a warning. The walls trembled as the creatures tried to force their way in. Elara grabbed Daniel's arm. "We have to get to the old church. It's the only place they can't enter." Daniel hesitated, looking at the dog, but the creature gave a short bark and moved toward the door, ready to follow. Together they slipped out the back, vanishing into the foggy night. The old church stood on a hill, its ancient stones glowing faintly in the moonlight. As they entered, Daniel felt a strange warmth, as though the walls themselves were alive with protective energy. Alara guided them to an underground chamber. There, carved into the walls, were more of the same symbols that adorned the dog's collar. "This place was built to protect the secret he carries," she whispered. As the dog lay in the center of the chamber, its collar glowed brighter, and suddenly, the form of the dog shimmered. For a moment, Daniel could see something else, something bigger, more powerful. A guardian spirit trapped in an earthly form. The vision faded quickly, but it left Daniel shaken. "What is he?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Alara looked at him solemnly. "He's the last of his kind." Before Daniel could ask more, a booming voice echoed through the church. "Give him to us, and we'll spare your lives." From the shadows emerged a tall, cloaked figure, its face hidden, but its presence radiating danger. The creatures had found them. Alara stood protectively in front of the dog. "You'll have to go through us first." Without warning, the figure lunged forward, and Alara countered with a burst of glowing energy. "Run!" she shouted to Daniel. Grabbing the dog, Daniel ran through the tunnels beneath the church, guided only by faint light from the collar. Behind him, he could hear the clash of magic and growls of the creatures as Alara fought to buy them time. The tunnels opened up to a hidden sanctuary, a place filled with stone statues of dogs, their eyes made of glowing gems. As Daniel placed the wounded dog on a stone altar, the entire room lit up. The dog's collar pulsed in response, and ancient mechanisms clicked into place. Slowly, the dog's wounds began to heal, and Daniel watched in awe as the creature regained some of its strength. The walls of the sanctuary began to glow brighter, and suddenly, a projection of an ancient being appeared. It was a tall figure, robed and crowned, speaking in a language Daniel couldn't understand. But somehow, he felt the meaning. It was a warning, a message left long ago. "Protect the Guardian, for when it falls, darkness will reclaim the world." Knowing there was no more running, Daniel decided to fight. Alara rejoined them, bruised but alive, carrying old weapons infused with magic. Together they made a plan to lure the dark creatures to the sanctuary, where the Guardian's power was strongest. The dog, now stronger, stood beside them, its eyes burning with a new determination. As dawn broke, the creatures attacked. The battle was fierce. Alara wielded powerful magic, Daniel used enchanted blades, and the dog fought with supernatural strength. Shadows clashed against light as the sanctuary itself seemed to join the battle, its walls pulsing with energy. In the final moment, the cloaked leader of the creatures struck a devastating blow to Alara, but before he could finish her, the dog lunged, sacrificing itself to protect her. As its body fell, a wave of light exploded from the collar, obliterating the creatures. Daniel and Alara ran to the dog's side, tears in their eyes. But as the light faded, they realized something miraculous. The dog was gone, but a young guardian spirit now stood before them, reborn. As the glowing spirit fully materialized, it looked at Daniel and Alara with wise, ancient eyes. "Thank you for saving me," it said in a soft, echoing voice. "I am Aldrin, the last guardian of the old world." Daniel stared in awe, while Alara, tears still on her cheeks, bowed her head respectfully. "We need you to help us end this darkness," she whispered. Aldrin waved his hand, and the walls of the sanctuary began to show images like moving paintings, scenes of a great war between light and darkness, of ancient guardians who once protected humanity, and of the betrayal that led to their downfall. "Thus you. Darkness is older than you know," Aldrin said, "and it has been waiting for a chance to return. There is one last weapon that can destroy the darkness forever," Aldrin revealed. He led them to a sealed door in the sanctuary. With a touch, it opened to reveal a sword, pulsing with radiant energy. It can only be wielded by one who has proven their heart. Daniel reached for the sword, and as his fingers wrapped around the hilt, it glowed brighter. accepting him as its master. Armed with the Sword of Light and Aldrin at their side, Daniel and Alara began their journey back to the heart of Eldridge, where the darkness had first taken root. Along the way, villagers, inspired by their bravery, began to join them, forming an unlikely army. The towering castle of darkness loomed ahead, surrounded by swirling black mist. "This is where it began," Aldrin whispered. Alara placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We finish it today." As they approached, shadow creatures swarmed the gates, but Daniel's sword glowed fiercely, cutting through them like light slicing the night. Inside the throne room, a massive dark figure sat on a throne made of bone and shadow. "So, the last guardian dares to face me," it hissed. Aldrin stepped forward, his form glowing brighter. "This ends now." With a roar, the Dark One charged. Daniel met him head-on, sword clashing against dark claws. Alara fired bursts of magic to shield Daniel, while Aldrin summoned beams of light to hold back the lesser creatures. The battle shook the walls of the castle. The Dark One, wounded but still strong, retreated to a hidden chamber deep within the castle. There, pulsing like a living thing, was the heart of darkness, the source of his power. "Destroy it," Aldrin urged, "but it will fight back." The Dark One unleashed all his remaining power to protect the heart. Shadows swirled violently, forming monstrous shapes. Alara and Aldrin fought to keep them at bay, while Daniel pressed forward, sword glowing brighter than ever. With a mighty roar, Daniel drove the Sword of Light into the heart of darkness. A blinding explosion of light filled the chamber, vaporizing the Dark One and all his minions. The castle began to collapse as beams of light shot into the sky, banishing the dark mist over Eldridge. As the sun rose over Eldridge, the people emerged from hiding, seeing the sky clear for the first time in years. Daniel, Alara, and Aldrin stood among the ruins, victorious but exhausted. "You've given us hope again," Aldrin said. "But the world will need protectors." Daniel looked at the sword in his hand, understanding his new role as guardian. With the darkness gone, Eldridge began to heal. The villagers, guided by Daniel and Alara, started rebuilding their shattered town. The people looked to Daniel not only as their savior, but as their new leader, and to Alara as the wise protector of old magic. Aldrin watched over them, offering guidance and ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. As they worked, the town slowly began to return to life. Flowers blooming, sunlight returning, and laughter filling the streets once again. Knowing that darkness could one day return, Daniel and Alara began training a new generation of guardians. Young men and women from the village eagerly joined, learning both sword and magic under their watchful eyes. Aldrin, in his spirit form, taught them about the ancient ways, passing down knowledge that had been lost for centuries. Together, they formed a circle of protectors that vowed to defend Eldridge and beyond. One evening, Aldrin took Daniel and Alara to a hidden chamber beneath the sanctuary, a place even Alara had never seen before. There, carved on the walls, were prophecies about future guardians and distant lands threatened by darkness. Aldrin placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Your journey is not over. You are the first of a new order, but others will need your help." Daniel and Alara exchanged looks, realizing that the battle for light and darkness spanned far beyond Eldridge. As Eldridge prospered, a rider arrived. One day from a distant kingdom, bearing a letter sealed with a strange emblem. The letter spoke of another land where the shadows had begun to rise. Daniel read the letter aloud, his expression growing serious. "They need us." Without hesitation, Daniel, Alara, and Aldrin prepared for a new journey, determined to carry the light wherever darkness dared to rise again. As they prepared to leave, the villagers gathered to thank them. Children hugged Daniel, and elders blessed Alara. "Promise you will return," an old woman whispered to Daniel. Daniel smiled, his hand on the Sword of Light. "I promise." With heavy hearts but steadfast resolve, the trio set out at dawn, leaving the peaceful village behind, bound for a new destiny. Traveling through vast forests, across rivers and over mountains, Daniel, Alara, and Aldrin ventured far beyond anything they had known. Along the way, they encountered wandering survivors, towns on the brink of falling to darkness, and remnants of the old Guardian's magic. Each stop strengthened their bond and made Daniel realize the depth of the responsibility he now carried. After weeks of travel, they reached the eastern lands where the sun seemed to set earlier and the shadows were deeper. Here the darkness was different, smarter, more cunning. It had infiltrated villages, corrupting people from within. They quickly realized this fight would require more than swords and spells. It would require wisdom and trust. They entered a grand city, once a beacon of hope, now wrapped in shadow. The people moved like ghosts, their eyes hollow. At the city's center, a false king ruled, a puppet of the darkness. Ilara whispered, "We must free them, but we must be careful." Daniel nodded, gripping his sword tightly. "We will bring back the light." As they searched for allies, Daniel and Ilara discovered a secret group of rebels who had not yet fallen to darkness. Led by a fierce young woman named Kyla, they plotted to overthrow the false king. Kyla eyed Daniel and Ilara skeptically. "You claim to be guardians? Prove it." Daniel unsheathed the sword of light, its glow filling the room. Kayla's eyes widened. "Maybe you are the help we've been praying for." Together with Kayla and her rebels, they prepared for an uprising. Aldrin taught the rebels ancient protection spells, while Daniel trained them in combat. Ilara worked on deciphering the dark enchantments surrounding the false king's castle, knowing they would need to break them to succeed. As the day of reckoning approached, the people of the city began to whisper of hope, a hope that had long been lost, but was now rekindled. As the night fell, the rebels gathered in an abandoned hall, sharpening their weapons and checking their gear. The tension was palpable. Daniel stood before them, sword of light gleaming in his hands. "Tomorrow, we fight not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has lost hope." Ilara moved among the rebels, giving quiet encouragement. Aldrin stood at the back, his spirit form casting a soft glow. "Remember, even the smallest light can drive away the darkness." At dawn, the rebellion began. The rebels stormed the streets, meeting resistance from the king's shadow-possessed guards. Daniel led the charge, his sword cutting through the shadows. Ilara protected the rear, casting shields to block attacks. Aldrin soared above, blasting beams of light to scatter enemies. As they reached the castle gates, the real fight began. Enchanted barriers blocked their way until Ilara, chanting an ancient spell, tore them down. Inside the throne room, the false king awaited, his form twisted by darkness. "You cannot win," he sneered. "This city belongs to me." Daniel stepped forward, sword raised. Not anymore. The battle was fierce. The king summoned dark creatures to his side, but with the help of Kayla and the rebels, Daniel and Ilara fought, their way to him. Aldrin struck the final blow, his light piercing the darkness within the king. With the king's fall, a wave of darkness burst from his body, threatening to consume everything. Ilara ran to the center of the room, raising her hands high as she began a powerful spell to absorb and disperse the dark magic. "Hold them back!" she cried as the shadows formed monstrous shapes. Daniel and Kayla stood guard, fighting off the darkness as Ilara's light grew stronger. Finally, with a flash, Ilara's spell completed, and the darkness shattered like glass. The people of the city, once hollow-eyed and broken, slowly regained themselves. They stepped out of their homes, blinking at the sunlight for the first time in years. Tears of joy flowed as families reunited and hope blossomed anew. Kayla turned to Daniel and Ilara. "You have saved us." Daniel smiled, but knew their journey wasn't over. "There are more places like this out there. We must continue." After days helping the city recover, Daniel, Ilara, and Aldrin prepared to leave. Kayla and her rebels stood at the gates to see them off. "You will always have friends here," Kayla promised. "If ever you call, we will come." With that, Daniel, Ilara, and Aldrin set out again, heading toward distant lands where darkness might still linger. As they traveled, Aldrin grew uneasy. "I feel it still," he said quietly. "The darkness is not gone. It has simply retreated." They paused at a cliff overlooking a valley. In the distance, black clouds swirled ominously over another city. Daniel tightened his grip on the sword of light. Then we keep moving. Arriving at the new city, they found it nearly abandoned. Ghostly figures roamed the streets, remnants of souls trapped between life and death. Alara gasped. "This place is cursed." Aldrin nodded grimly. "This is the work of an ancient darkness, one that preys on the souls of the living." In the center of the city stood a massive tower, dark energy swirling at its peak. "The source is there," Aldrin pointed. Inside the tower, they faced the Keeper of Souls, a shadowy being that fed on the spirits of the dead. It sneered at them. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Daniel raised his sword. "We'll see." As they ascended the tower, waves of ghostly enemies attacked. Daniel fought valiantly, his sword glowing brighter with each step. Alara cast spells of protection, while Aldrin held the spirits back with his own light. At the top, they faced the Keeper. The battle was long and grueling. Every time Daniel struck a blow, the Keeper reformed from shadows. But when Daniel and Alara combined, their power, light and magic intertwined, they finally overwhelmed the Keeper, shattering its form and freeing the trapped souls. With the Keeper destroyed, sunlight broke through the black clouds. The souls, now free, ascended peacefully into the sky, thanking their saviors with soft whispers that echoed in the wind. Daniel watched as the city began to heal, the air clearing and flowers blooming along cracked streets. Yet he knew the journey was not over. That night, as they camped outside the city, Aldrin sat silently, watching the stars. "There is a greater darkness," he finally said. "Stronger than all we have faced." Daniel looked to Alara, determination in his eyes. "Then we will face it, together." Alara smiled softly. Together, guided by Aldrin's visions, they set out toward the fabled Darklands, a place untouched by light for centuries. It was said that the original darkness that corrupted the world first took root there. As they traveled, the land grew colder and darker, the sun barely piercing the thick clouds overhead. Strange creatures stalked them from the shadows, remnants of old curses. Alara studied them, realizing these were beings of pure shadow, untouched by time. "We must be careful," she warned. "These are unlike anything we've faced." Daniel kept his sword ready, knowing the closer they got, the more dangerous it would become. Finally, they reached the border of the Darklands, a vast chasm filled with swirling black mist. On the other side, ruins of a long-forgotten kingdom loomed. Aldrin looked out over the abyss. "This is where it all began. And this is where we will end it." Daniel nodded. "Let's finish what was started." The only way to cross the abyss was an ancient bridge, crumbling and unstable. Alara tested it with a cautious step. "It holds, but barely." One by one they crossed, Daniel leading with the sword of light illuminating the path. Shadows writhed below, reaching up as if to pull them into the darkness. Aldrin kept them at bay with bursts of radiant energy. On the other side, they found themselves in a dead city, ruins of a once great kingdom swallowed by shadow. Statues of forgotten kings stood broken, their eyes hollow. "This place was once a beacon of hope," Aldrin whispered, before the darkness claimed it. As they moved deeper, they could feel the weight of centuries of sorrow pressing down on them. While exploring a shattered hall, Alara discovered old carvings depicting the kingdom's fall. How a great king made a pact with darkness to save his people, only to doom them all. History warns us, yet people repeat the same mistakes, she murmured, tracing the worn lines with her fingers. Daniel clenched his sword. Not this time. At the heart of the ruins stood a towering citadel, shrouded in black mist. Dark energy pulsed from within, radiating an oppressive force that made even Aldrin falter. "The source of all darkness is inside," Aldrin said. "We must be prepared." Before they could enter, a massive creature of pure shadow emerged, a guardian, bound to protect the citadel. It was larger than any beast they had faced, with eyes glowing red and claws that dripped shadow. The battle was fierce. Daniel struck with the sword of light, while Alara unleashed waves of magic. Aldrin blasted beams of pure radiance, but the creature kept coming. Finally, Daniel leapt onto its back and drove his sword into its core, breaking its form into shards, a fading shadow. Inside the citadel, a spiral staircase wound deep underground where the shadows were thickest. The walls seemed alive, pulsing like veins carrying dark magic. As they descended, whispers filled the air, voices of those lost to darkness, begging for release. "Stay strong," Daniel urged. "We're here to end this." At the bottom, they entered, a massive chamber lit only by the sword of light. On a throne of black crystal sat a figure cloaked in shadow, the Dark King, the original ruler who had made the deadly pact. He looked up, his eyes gleaming. "You dare enter my domain?" Aldrin stepped forward. "Your reign ends now." The Dark King rose, shadow wings unfurling, and with a wave of his hand, summoned a storm of dark magic. It struck the ground around them, creating pits of writhing shadows. Daniel charged, meeting the Dark King's blade with his own. Sparks of light and shadow flew as they clashed. Alara focused on shielding Daniel, while Aldrin worked to weaken the King's defenses with light. The battle raged as Daniel fought the Dark King, their swords meeting again and again. Alara joined in with magic attacks that forced the King to split his focus. "You cannot defeat me," the King roared. "I am eternal." "Not while we stand," Daniel shouted, pressing forward. In a desperate move, the Dark King unleashed all his stored dark magic, causing the entire citadel to tremble. Shadows poured from the walls, taking monstrous forms and attacking from all sides. Aldrin unleashed a brilliant wave of light, shielding Alara and Daniel. "Hold the line." Together, they fought back the tide, inching closer to the throne. Alara noticed that dark chains bound the King's soul to the throne. "We need to break those," she cried. While Daniel held the King at bay, Alara and Aldrin focused their magic on the chains. Light and magic wove together, burning through the darkness. With a final surge of power, the chains shattered, and the King staggered. Daniel seized the moment, striking the King's chest with the sword of light. A scream of agony filled the chamber as the shadow peeled away from him, revealing a frail, ancient man beneath. "Thank you," the man whispered as he crumbled into dust, finally free of the curse. With the King's fall, the citadel began to collapse. "We need to get out," Aldrin shouted. They ran up the spiral stairs as the walls fell around them, dodging falling stones and fleeing shadows. As they burst out of the citadel, the structure collapsed behind them, sending up a cloud of dust and light. As dawn broke, light flooded the ruined kingdom. The oppressive darkness that had loomed for centuries lifted. Flowers bloomed where once only decay reigned. Aldrin smiled. "It is done." Daniel looked over the valley. A new beginning. Though tired, they knew there was still much to do. Alara placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Wherever darkness rises again, we'll be there." Daniel nodded. Together, Aldrin's form shimmered in the sunlight. "And I will guide you." With hope in their hearts and light by their side, they turned to face the road ahead, knowing that though the battle was won, their journey as guardians had only just begun. Weeks passed since the fall of the Dark King. The once cursed land slowly healed under the warm touch of the sun. Villagers, long in hiding, began to return, astonished by the beauty that replaced the desolation. Birds sang again, and streams ran clear. Daniel, Alara, and Aldrin helped rebuild what had been lost. The people revered them, but Daniel remained humble. "We fought not for glory," he often said, "but for the chance to give you back your home." While exploring the remnants of the citadel, Alara stumbled upon a hidden library sealed behind layers of stone and magic. The books inside were ancient, containing knowledge long forgotten, spells, history, and secrets of the realm. Aldrin inspected the tomes. "Some of these writings predate even me. There may be wisdom here that will help defend the world from future darkness." Daniel picked up a weathered book titled The Guardians of Light. "We may not be the first to walk this path," he mused. One evening, as the sun set and a calm breeze swayed the trees, Aldrin's form flickered uneasily. "Something is amiss," he said, eyes narrowing. "I sense a disturbance far to the north." Alara stood, concern written on her face. "Another darkness?" "Not darkness," Aldrin replied. "Something older, something watching." News of strange occurrences reached them. Animals behaving wildly, villagers speaking of unnatural lights in the sky, and whispers of a forgotten god waking from slumber. Daniel called a meeting. "We cannot rest yet. If this threat rises, we must be ready." Alara nodded. "And if the knowledge we found in the library can help, we must study it well." Realizing they couldn't face future threats alone, Daniel proposed training new guardians. "There are others with light in their hearts. We must find them." They traveled to nearby villages seeking those brave enough to join their cause. Some came willingly, others needed convincing. But slowly, a new order of guardians began to form. "This is bigger than us," Alara said to Daniel as they watched the trainees. "We're building a future." Though the land healed, Daniel sometimes saw fleeting shadows out of the corner of his eye. It may just be habit, he told himself, but deep down, he wondered if some remnants of the Dark King's magic lingered. One night, as he walked alone, a whisper drifted through the air. "Not over yet." Following Aldrin's warning, the trio set out to investigate the northern disturbances. The journey was long and treacherous, taking them through dense forests and icy mountains. At the peaks, they discovered ancient ruins, half buried in snow, symbols etched in stone, glowing faintly with a strange light. "This is not shadow magic," Aldrin said, tracing a rune. "This is older." In the heart of the ruins, they found a colossal figure encased in ice, a being of immense power, its eyes closed as if in deep slumber. "What is this?" Daniel whispered. "A forgotten god," Aldrin answered grimly. "Sealed long ago. But for how? Much longer?" Cracks spiderwebbed across the ice that imprisoned the god. The magic that had held it for eons was weakening. Alara studied the seals. "These were placed by powerful mages. If they are breaking, something, or someone, is causing it." Daniel tightened his grip on the Sword of Light. "We need to find out who." Realizing the threat was beyond anything they had faced, the trio returned home to prepare. They doubled their efforts, training new guardians and deciphering ancient texts. Aldrin addressed the gathered warriors. "The battle against darkness was only the beginning. A storm is coming, and we must be ready." Alara raised her staff. "For the light." Daniel lifted his sword, the blade gleaming in the dawn. "For the future." Together they faced the rising sun, knowing that the true test of their courage was yet to come. Realizing they could not face the rising threat alone, Daniel, Alara, and Aldrin set out to gather allies beyond their lands. They visited neighboring kingdoms, some still recovering from their own battles. Though hesitant, many leaders recognized the signs of an ancient danger and agreed to form a coalition. Among the new allies was a fierce warrior named Kyle, known for his unmatched skill with twin blades, and a healer named Leora, whose powers could mend both flesh and spirit. "We stand with you," Kyle said, gripping Daniel's arm. "No darkness shall take our world while we draw breath." Back at the northern peaks, the ice holding the ancient god now showed deep fissures. Each day, the cracks widened and the air grew colder, filled with a sinister energy. "The seals won't hold much longer," Alara warned, her fingers tracing glowing sigils. "We must find a way to reinforce them, or we'll face a force unlike any other." While studying the ancient tomes, Daniel was struck by a powerful vision. He found himself standing in a time long past, watching as mighty sorcerers fought the ancient god to imprison it. He saw the god in its full glory, towering, with eyes that burned like stars, and a voice that shook the heavens. The sorcerers barely succeeded, sacrificing themselves to seal it away. When Daniel awoke, his resolve was hardened. "Now I know what we face, and I will not let their sacrifice be in vain." Aldrin revealed that to fight such a god, Daniel would need to awaken deeper powers within himself. "You must undertake the trials of light," Aldrin said. Few have survived them, but if you do, you'll be ready. Ilara insisted on accompanying him. You won't face this alone. Together, they journeyed to the sacred Temple of Light, hidden in a valley bathed in eternal dawn. Daniel's first trial took him into a realm where his worst fears became reality. He faced visions of losing Ilara and Aldrin, of the land falling to darkness. But as despair threatened to overwhelm him, he remembered the faces of those he fought to protect. Drawing strength from their memory, Daniel stood tall. Fear will not control me. The illusion shattered, and he passed the first trial. In the second trial, Daniel encountered a wounded enemy, a creature once corrupted by the Dark King. He had to choose between mercy and vengeance. Remembering the lessons he learned through his journey, Daniel chose compassion, healing the creature rather than striking it down. The creature bowed to him, and the trial ended. You have chosen the harder path, a voice echoed, and for that, you are stronger. The final trial forced Daniel to confront the ultimate question. What was he willing to sacrifice for the world's safety? A vision of a world saved, but it was. The cost of his own life stood before him. With a steady voice, Daniel said, "If my life is the price for peace, I pay it gladly." The temple filled with light, and the trials were complete. The sword of light pulsed with newfound power in his hand. Upon returning, a mysterious figure awaited them. A seer from the old times, cloaked in silver robes, with eyes that saw beyond time. "The god awakens," the seer said, "but there is still hope. You have walked the path of light. Now you must face the darkness at the heart of the mountain." United, the coalition army began its march north. Guardians, warriors, and mages alike, their banners flying high. The skies darkened as they neared the frozen peaks, and strange creatures stirred in the shadows. Kale rode beside Daniel. "If this is our last stand, let it be remembered." As they arrived, the ice prison shattered in a thunderous explosion. The god, now free, rose in all its terrifying majesty. Its voice was like the rumble of 1,000 storms. "Who dares stand against me?" Daniel stepped forward, sword glowing. "We do." Behind him, the army stood ready, a wall of determination and courage. The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of the world hung in the balance. The battle erupted with a roar as the god unleashed waves of icy wind and dark energy. Guardians raised shields of light to protect the army, while mages hurled fire and lightning to counter the storm. Kale led the charge with his twin blades, slicing through monstrous creatures that emerged from the shadows. Daniel and Ilara fought side by side, their powers intertwined. The sword of light blazed with radiant energy, deflecting the god's attacks, while Ilara summoned barriers and beams of pure light. "We must weaken it before we conceal it again," Aldrin shouted, casting ancient spells from atop a ridge. As the battle raged, Daniel realized the god's power stemmed from a dark crystal embedded in its chest. "That crystal is the key," he yelled to Ilara. Focusing their efforts, the trio launched an all-out assault on the crystal. Arrows of energy, bolts of lightning, and strikes from the sword of light battered the god, but it retaliated fiercely, sending shockwaves that knocked many warriors to the ground. Still, they pressed on. In a devastating blow, the god struck Ilara, sending her crashing to the frozen ground. Daniel rushed to her side, rage and sorrow fueling his power. "You will not take her from me," he roared, his sword blazing brighter than ever. As Aldrin and the mages formed a circle to channel a binding spell, Daniel fought with all his might to buy them time. The god's voice echoed across the peaks. "You cannot defeat me!" But Daniel's heart, filled with love and determination, pushed him beyond his limits. With a mighty leap, Daniel reached the god's chest, plunging the sword of light into the crystal. The blade sank deep, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. A burst of blinding light erupted as the god let out a deafening scream. The crystal shattered, releasing a shockwave that knocked everyone to their knees. Slowly, the god began to dissolve into mist, its form breaking apart as it was finally defeated. As the mist cleared, the sun broke through the dark clouds, casting golden rays across the land. The warriors stood, battered but alive. Alara stirred, and Daniel helped her to her feet, tears of relief in his eyes. "It's over," she whispered. Aldrin approached, nodding solemnly. "For now. But let us never forget the price we paid." The coalition returned home as heroes. Villages were rebuilt, and life began anew. Daniel and Alara stood on a hill overlooking the valley, watching as children played and families reunited. "We have a chance to build a better world," Alara said. Softly, Daniel took her hand, "and we'll protect it together." As the sun rose on a new day, a sense of peace finally settled over the land. Hard-won, but cherished. And though the shadows had been banished, the Guardians vowed to always stand, watch ready to defend the light for all time. Months had passed since the final battle, and peace seemed to settle like a gentle breeze over the lands. Yet one stormy night, as rain poured and winds howled, a knock echoed on Daniel's door. When he opened it, standing there, soaked and trembling, was a man with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. A stranger, but something about him felt familiar. "You don't know me," the man said, his voice weak. "But the danger is not over. The god was only a servant." Daniel's heart sank. "Come inside. Tell me everything." Around a roaring fire, the stranger revealed his name. Corwin, a seer who had fled from a forgotten realm beyond the mountains. "The god you fought was a guardian, bound to prevent a greater evil from awakening. Now that it's gone, the true darkness stirs." He handed Daniel an ancient scroll, sealed with symbols older than any Daniel had seen. "This prophecy speaks of what's to come, a force that will devour worlds." Far to the east, in desolate lands where no man dared go, dark clouds swirled in unnatural shapes. Creatures moved within them, winged beasts and shadowy giants. The earth cracked open, spewing black mist that poisoned the air. Alara and Daniel stood atop the watchtower, seeing the distant darkness on the horizon. "It's starting," Alara said quietly. "We need to be ready," Daniel replied, determination in his eyes. Realizing they needed help, Daniel and Alara began seeking out the old guard, warriors and mages who had fought in wars long before their time. Some lived in hiding, others had sworn off battle. First they found Marwyn, an archer whose arrows never missed. Then Thorn, a giant of a man with a hammer that could shatter stone. One by one, they joined Daniel's cause, recognizing the storm that loomed. In the deepest part of the eastern wastelands, atop a throne of bones, sat the Dark Queen, an ancient sorceress sealed away for centuries. The death of the god had weakened the barriers holding her prison. Her eyes snapped open, burning with crimson fire. Finally, freedom. She raised her hand, summoning her generals, beasts, demons, and corrupted kings. Prepare. The world will kneel. Daniel's forces, though small, launched a preemptive strike against the Dark Queen's scouts. In a forest near the border, they ambushed a squad of shadow creatures. Kale led the charge, blades flashing. Alara cast protective wards while Daniel's sword of light cut through the darkness. But the shadows fought back fiercely, and even as they won the skirmish, it was clear the enemy was evolving, becoming stronger. As night fell, the sky filled with strange lights, patterns that moved like waves. Aldrin, now an elder among mages, read their meaning. The ancients are warning us. The Dark Queen seeks the heart of the world, a source of all magic. If she claims it, nothing will stop her. Daniel gripped his sword tighter. Then we must find it first. Led by Corwin, they ventured into the forbidden desert, where the heart of the world was said to lie hidden. Sandstorms raged around them, and ancient guardians, giant stone beasts, rose to block their path. "Only those worthy may pass," the guardians intoned. Daniel stepped forward, sword raised. "Then test us." The trials of the desert had begun, and the fate of the world once again hung in the balance. As the sun blazed overhead, Daniel and his companions stood before the massive stone guardians. Their eyes, carved from ancient emerald, glowed as they watched the group. "To pass, you must show unity, strength, and wisdom," the first guardian rumbled. "Prove you are worthy." A series of trials began. First, A battle against sand spirits, swirling vortices of razor-sharp wind and dust. Kyle led the charge with swift blades, while Alara shielded them from deadly gusts. Daniel's sword carved through the spirits with radiant light scattering them into dust. Next, they were led into a labyrinth, where shifting walls and illusions sought to divide them. Whispers filled the air, trying to turn them against each other. But Alara, wise and calm, reminded them of their bond. Remember why we fight, together. Holding hands, they walked as one, breaking through the illusions and emerging on the other side. The second guardian bowed its head in respect. The last guardian, a giant stone lion, presented the hardest trial, one of sacrifice. It conjured an illusion of Alara in mortal danger, pleading for help. Daniel, torn between saving her and completing the trial, realized the truth. This is not real. I trust her strength as much as mine. The illusion faded, and the guardian stepped aside. You are worthy. The gates to the heart of the world opened, revealing a glowing cavern filled with pure energy, swirling like liquid starlight. Inside, the heart pulsed with life. A massive crystal, suspended in midair, radiated waves of power. It was beautiful and terrifying, the source of all magic in the world. But as they approached, a shadow fell over them. The Dark Queen's lieutenant, a winged demon named Malakar, had arrived first. You're too late, Malakar sneered, drawing a sword forged of shadow. A fierce battle erupted within the cavern. Lightning clashed against shadow as Alara and Aldrin fought to protect the heart. Kyle and Marwan faced Malakar's minions, while Daniel took on Malakar himself. Sword met sword, light against darkness, in a clash that shook the cavern walls. Sparks of raw magic flew as Daniel fought to keep Malakar from reaching the heart. I won't let you have it, Daniel roared, forcing Malakar back with a surge of radiant power. Just as Malakar gained the upper hand, Alara unleashed a massive beam of light that struck the demon, giving Daniel the opening to strike. With a powerful thrust, Daniel pierced Malakar's chest, and the demon let out a shriek before dissolving into shadow. But the victory was short-lived. The heart trembled, reacting to the violence. Aldrin stepped forward. The heart is unstable. If we don't calm it, it could destroy everything. Daniel sheathed his sword and approached the crystal. Placing his hand on its surface, he spoke from his heart. We fight to protect this world, not to take your power. Help us stop the Dark Queen. The crystal pulsed, recognizing Daniel's sincerity. A beam of light shot into Daniel's chest, filling him with ancient magic. The cavern calmed, and the heart's energy settled into a soft glow. It has chosen you, Aldrin whispered, awed. With the power of the heart now flowing through Daniel, they returned to their allies, preparing for the final war. The Dark Queen's army gathered in the east, a sea of shadows ready to engulf the world. Daniel stood before his united forces, now stronger than ever. This is our world. We fight for our future, for those who cannot fight, for love, for light. As the army roared in agreement, Daniel looked toward the horizon, knowing the final battle was near. As night fell over the camp, a tense silence settled among the warriors. Fires flickered, casting long shadows as Daniel walked among his people, offering words of courage and unity. Alara stood beside him, her eyes glowing faintly from the magic coursing within her. Kyle sharpened his blades and Marwan consulted her scrolls, seeking any last-minute spells that might aid them. Leora moved through the camp, healing minor wounds and whispering prayers to strengthen their spirits. Daniel paused, looking up at the stars. Tomorrow, everything changes. At dawn, they saw it, an endless sea of dark figures stretching across the plains. Armored beasts, twisted creatures, and cloaked sorcerers, all under the Dark Queen's command. Above them, storm clouds churned, lightning cracking with unnatural fury. On a black steed, the Dark Queen herself appeared, her eyes like burning coals. Surrender, and I may spare some of you, her voice boomed across the fields. Daniel stepped forward, sword shining in the gray light. We will never surrender. The armies collided with an earth-shaking roar. Steel clashed against steel, magic flared against shadow. Daniel led the charge, his sword cutting through darkness, while Kale danced around enemies, his twin blades swift and deadly. Ilara summoned walls of light to shield their warriors, while Aldrin unleashed waves of elemental fury, fire, and ice, raining upon the Dark Queen's beasts. Everywhere, the field was chaos, a storm of battle where every step was a fight to survive. As the battle raged, losses mounted. Brave warriors fell under the onslaught of shadow creatures. Even with the power of the heart, Daniel struggled to hold the line. Leora wept as she healed, but some wounds were too deep. Kale fought beside Daniel, but even his unmatched skill couldn't protect everyone. "We can't hold forever," he shouted. Daniel gritted his teeth. "We hold as long as we must." With a scream that split the sky, the Dark Queen entered the fray. Darkness poured from her, sweeping away soldiers like leaves in a storm. Her eyes locked on Daniel, and she raised a sword wreathed in shadow. "So you are the one chosen by the heart? Let me see if you're worthy." She struck, and their blades met in a blast of light and darkness. The final duel had begun. Daniel and the Dark Queen clashed with the fury of titans. Each strike sent shockwaves across the battlefield. Her magic lashed at him, but the heart's power shielded him from the worst. "Why fight, Daniel?" she hissed. "You could have power beyond imagining. Join me." Daniel's eyes burned with resolve. "I fight for love, for hope, for a world without fear." With a roar, he struck harder, driving her back step by step. Meanwhile, Ilara, Kale, Aldrin, and the others fought desperately to hold back the Dark Queen's forces. Ilara unleashed her full power, beams of pure light searing the sky. Kale dueled, a shadow knight, their blades a blur of sparks. Aldrin called forth a storm to scatter the winged demons above. But for every enemy they defeated, more took their place. As Daniel faltered under a brutal strike, the heart within him flared, its energy surging into every fiber of his being. His sword glowed with blinding light as he rose to his feet, renewed. "You will not win," he shouted, and with a mighty swing, he shattered the Dark Queen's sword. She screamed in rage, but Daniel pressed on, his strikes faster, stronger, fueled by the heart's full power. The final blow loomed, and all around them the battlefield seemed to freeze as light and shadow prepared for their ultimate clash. As Daniel raised his sword, a brilliant light erupted from the blade, illuminating the battlefield in a radiant glow that pushed back the shadows. The Dark Queen, her eyes wide with fury and fear, tried to summon one last wave of darkness, but it was too late. With a cry that echoed through the heavens, Daniel brought his sword down in a sweeping arc. The light consumed the Dark Queen, her form dissolving into mist and shadow, and with a final scream, she was gone. All around, the shadow creatures faltered, then began to vanish, leaving behind only silence and the battered warriors who had survived. The clouds above broke apart, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, sunlight bathed the land. The warriors stared in awe as the sky turned from dark gray to soft blue, and birds began to sing again. Ilara rushed to Daniel's side, her eyes filled with tears. "You did it. We did it," Daniel whispered, exhausted but smiling. "Together." Kale limped over, grinning through his bruises. "Remind me to never challenge you to a duel." Leora and Aldrin joined them, and slowly the surviving warriors gathered, realizing they had won. The war was over. In the days that followed, they built a great memorial to honor those who had given their lives. Names were carved into stone, and flowers were laid in remembrance. Daniel stood before the monument, his hand resting on the cold stone. "Your sacrifice will never be forgotten." Ilara placed a hand on his shoulder. "They live on in us." The people of the land, freed from the shadow's grip, began to rebuild their homes. Fields that had been burned were replanted, and towns that had been destroyed began to rise again. With the Dark Queen gone, peace returned to the world. But Daniel knew that their work was not done. He gathered his companions. "We've won a great victory, but we must ensure this peace lasts. We must guide the world to a better future." Ilara nodded. "The magic of the heart still lives in you. You can lead them." Daniel shook his head. "Not alone. Together." And so, they set out to bring unity to the lands, helping villages and cities heal from the scars of war. forging alliances, and spreading hope. As Daniel and Alara traveled, they returned one evening to the quiet village where it had all begun, the Eye, place where the wounded dog had first appeared at Daniel's door. To their astonishment, the dog was there, waiting for them. But as they approached, the dog shimmered and transformed into an ethereal figure, a guardian spirit of the heart itself. "You were chosen long before you knew," the spirit said softly. "The heart sought one who would fight for love and light. You answered its call." Daniel's eyes filled with wonder. "So you were watching all along, guiding me." The spirit nodded. "And now, a new chapter begins. The heart will always need guardians." With that revelation, Daniel and his companions knew their journey was far from over. They would become the new guardians of the heart, protectors of the balance between light and darkness. Together, they swore an oath beneath the moonlit sky to defend the world from any new threats that might arise, ensuring that peace once won would never be lost again. And as the spirit of the heart watched over them, the land healed and hope was reborn. Months passed, and the world began to flourish under the newfound peace. Villages that had once been ruins now bustled with life. Children played in the fields, and laughter returned to homes that had known only sorrow. A great festival was held to celebrate the victory over darkness, and people from every corner of the land gathered to honor the heroes who had saved them. Daniel stood before the gathered crowd, Alara, Kale, Aldrin, and Leora at his side. "Today," Daniel began, his voice strong yet humble, "we celebrate not just a victory over darkness, but the strength of unity, courage, and hope." The people cheered, and music filled the air as night fell and lanterns were lit, symbolizing the light that now guided their future. Later that night, Daniel found himself walking alone under the stars, reflecting on the long journey. The memories of the battles fought, friends lost, and victories won filled his mind. Ilara joined him, her hand finding his. "You carry so much weight on your shoulders, Daniel," she said softly. He smiled, though sadness lingered in his eyes. "It's strange. After all we've done, I still feel there's so much to protect." Ilara leaned her head on his shoulder. "We'll protect it together." Daniel nodded. "Together. Always." As dawn approached, the spirit of the heart appeared once more to Daniel and his friends. "The world is safe for now, but you must remain vigilant. Light and darkness are always in balance." Daniel bowed respectfully. "We will." The spirit smiled warmly. "Your bond, your love, and your courage will be the greatest shield this world has." With those final words, the spirit began to fade, leaving behind a faint glow that warmed their hearts. Standing on a hill overlooking the sunrise, Daniel turned to his companions. "There will always be shadows, but now we know we have the strength to face them," Kyle chuckled. "As long as we stick together," Aldrin added. "And as long as there's a pint of ale waiting at the end of each quest," Leora laughed. "And healing. For the wounds we pick up along the way." Ilara took Daniel's hand. "We'll write a new story for this world, one of hope and peace." Daniel smiled, his heart full. "Then let's begin." Epilogue. The legend lives on years past, and the tale of Daniel and his companions became legend, told around fires and passed from generation to generation. The story of a wounded dog who appeared at a stranger's door, of a man who answered the call of destiny, and of friends who stood against darkness to bring light to the world. Though Daniel and his friends grew older, their bond never faded, and the heart, ever watchful, continued to shine in those who dared to stand for love, courage, and unity. Thus, the story ended, but the legacy lived on, in every heart that chose light over darkness, and in every soul that believed in the power of hope.